Scientists say our climate future looks a lot like we're seeing now, only supercharged. Look at the last year here in Colorado. We've seen unprecedented wildfires wiping hundreds of homes off the map. Weeks of smoky skies, rivers running black with ash, and hillsides coming down from summer afternoon storms. Climate change can make all these events more frequent and more intense. Even tiny changes on the global scale make these devastating events more likely.
Right now, we're on a path for things to get worse, and they don't have to be this way. Scientists have told us again and again what we have to do to avoid a warmer planet with worsening disasters. Cut the amount of heat-trapping stuff that we're sending into the atmosphere in half over the next 9 years, and end those emissions entirely by 2050. The how is hard, but not impossible, so let's talk about it. Today, we've brought together experts to answer your questions about climate change and what we can do in Colorado and how we can stop it.
So we want to welcome to the show Dr. Becky Bollinger, our assistant state climatologist, also a researcher at CSU. Also with us is Dr. Ben Livna, a researcher at CU Boulder and the director of the Western Water Assessment. Thank you both for joining us, and we'll start with a question for both of you, with a viewer asking, if we don't escape from fossil fuels and cut emissions, what are the consequences? What concerns you most about what could be in our future? So, Becky, let's start with you and get your feedback on that.
Thanks. Yeah, so we know that we are already experiencing warming and the impacts from warming, and we know that we're going to have further warming regardless of the actions that we take. But taking action is going to help limit that warming, which is going to limit the scale of the impacts that we could experience. So the things that concern me now are drought, first and foremost, because it's something that I see very frequently in our state. We have seen it increase quite substantially in terms of frequency and severity since the turn of the century. And that is something that I expect to continue. And the droughts that we are experiencing now are more temperature driven. So the more warming that we have, the more severe those droughts are going to be. And that's going to be the same for other impacts as well. So for me, doing the things that we can do to reduce those emissions and eventually get to no emissions will reduce that amount of warming, and thus we won't have as extreme of the impacts as we are expecting in the future.
Ben, I'd like to get your feedback on that same question about consequences and concerns.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. So I think one of the big impacts with warmer temperatures, as Becky talked about, is less snow in the mountains. And snow is so important for water supply, but also for recreation and other things. Actually, some of our frontline communities, smaller communities without access to larger reservoirs, they really rely on reservoirs or as snowpack as a natural reservoir that actually stores winter precipitation and then releases it in the summer when they need it. So I think there's a really important impact there with the snowpack as well.
Thank you for that. Becky, this next question is for you. Mark from Sterling is asking, how can future temperatures be accurately forecast when this is as complex as the human brain?
Thanks for that question, Mark. It is a really good question. Our globe is incredibly complex. We do have a hard time pinpointing the exact temperature that we're going to see in Denver on Saturday. So how are these climate models able to tell us what's coming? And a lot of it is that there are so many models and they're all doing a range of scenarios. So there's not just one answer for one location. There are many possible answers and a range of possible scenarios. And so it's really important for scientists to assess all of those possible scenarios and to communicate to you what are the range of possible outcomes. So similar to if I drop a pebble in a lake, I know what's exactly going to happen right in that spot, but models get more complicated as you go out from that initial point. It's going to be the same thing for climate change. We know that the temperature will warm when you have more of these greenhouse gases trapping the solar radiation within our atmosphere. That's the part we know, and we're really confident on. And then as that model goes out and predicts the other thing, the confidence becomes a little bit less. And so there's this whole range of possibilities. And so if you hear something very black and white, this is what the answer is, that is likely not true. We don't know exactly what the answer is going to be, which is why we really rely on that entire range of scenarios.
Sure, many pebbles, different sizes, different weights. We have
Yes.
to wait until they actually land. Ben, you talked about snow. Chuck from Arvada has a question about snowmaking and the water used for it. He says, with the drought in Colorado, should that water be used for something else? What does snowmaking do for our water and drought situation?
Yeah, so I would say, Chuck, your concern is valid, that if you've seen snowmaking, you can see snow kind of being spread out across the landscape, but you also see water kind of going up into the atmosphere. So I think to understand this a little bit more, we can say that we can think about how water is lost during snowmaking. So, one of the ways is what you see, like, water enters the atmosphere from the snow gun, and then it essentially evaporates. Another way, which is sort of unseen, is that snow under your skis actually also enters the atmosphere through a process called sublimation and evaporation. And then the other thing is, in the spring, snow melts on the ski slopes and it enters the soil, and some of it actually gets taken up by plants and trees. And so those are some ways that it is lost. But I should emphasize, actually, that the majority of snowmaking water actually returns to the stream. So the water that's taken out, maybe 80% of that water gets returned. And I'd say that water does a lot of good things, right? So there's the economic value of the ski industry, kind of the direct value locally, but also in the region, right? We get tourism and other things. I also think that getting people out skiing raises awareness. People get to see nature, they get to see water. So even though some water is lost, I would say that because the majority goes downstream and it does so much economic good, that I think it's probably a net positive, and that I wouldn't say that we should change what we're doing.
That's interesting, and we haven't really seen that snow here in the city that you've been talking about. So that leads perfectly into the next question, Becky, because 2021 hasn't been as bad for wildfires. I mean, comparing it to 2020, goodness gracious. But we had those 3 large wildfires that lost hundreds of homes, people died. This summer, we had fires in the mountain and western slope communities, not as massive and devastating as we saw last year. What factors help give us a break this year, and what could climate change do when we talk about wildfire risk?
This is a really good question, because we know that wildfires are one of the impacts that is closely connected to climate change. Specifically for Colorado, we have so many forests, and we know that wildfire is a natural part of the ecosystem. But the wildfire season for a lot of these forests really starts when that snow is melted out and things start warming up and drying out. So in a warming climate, when you melt that snow, possibly earlier, or start accumulating the snow later, you are increasing the window of time that you could have that risk for wildfire. Now, 2020 was a really interesting case because the snowpack wasn't too bad, and our normal high risk for wildfires is in June, which we did not have. But what we did have, and I mentioned this before, we're getting into that temperature-driven drought idea. And the temperature-driven drought was really apparent in our summer last summer. Right. So not only did we have a precipitation deficit, but really high temperatures. So we were dry and we were hot. And so when we went into the fall, we had these really hot temperatures, which is putting that further stress on the vegetation. You're increasing evaporative demand, so the atmosphere wants to take more moisture from the ground, and you just make that vegetation ripe and perfect for quickly spreading wildfires, which is unfortunately what we saw last year. This year, in the summer, we had the warmer temperatures, but we didn't have as dry of conditions. We had higher dew points, and that helped limit the evaporative demand, which is why I don't think we had the fires we had like
so
last
much
year.
stress, so much pressure, and we're still feeling the effects of that a year later, and will for a while. We're going to take a break. We'll be continuing the conversation with Becky Bollinger and Ben Libna.
And next, we're talking about what Coloradans can do to help solve the climate crisis. Students from Colorado are at the table as world leaders negotiate global commitments to change.
This is no time to wait around at this point.
A student shares how her work in Fort Collins is fueling a message of hope on the world stage. Plus, we'll talk to an activist who travels across Colorado, talking solutions with some of the hardest hit communities. Welcome back to our Colorado Climate Town Hall. We'll continue the conversation with our experts in a moment. First, though, a big development today out of the climate talks in Scotland.
China promising to be more aggressive about cutting emissions. That cooperation is, of course, critical. Some advocates are frustrated that China hasn't made pledges like other countries. Researchers at the Global Carbon Project found that China sends more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year than any other nation. Actually, the United States is responsible for the more emissions over time, though. China's climate envoy says they will work with the U.S. to create what they call pragmatic rules around cutting carbon and methane emissions, as well as fighting deforestation. It's a big shift in tone that might be critical in making a worldwide deal. Now, Ben and Becky are back with us. And when you look at Colorado and where we are now, as far as any solutions that are on the table, what gives you hope right now about where we're headed at the present? Becky, we'll start with you again.
Yeah, so what gives me hope is that we live in a state with many agencies that are very passionate about solving this problem, and we're very proactive instead of reactive, which I think is important. And what's also really important is that the people who live in our state, all of you, really care. You care about the state and the environment and making this place a better place to live, and that gives me hope.
Ben, how about you? Let's talk about hope. What gives you hope?
Yeah, thanks. I'm hopeful, I think, in the most part, because I think Coloradans are really well informed and we really treasure our wilderness and our water. And that makes us sort of open to change and new ideas. And just to note that we've really benefited from some of the impressive infrastructure that we have that was built by past generations and really has allowed us to thrive. And I see us continuing to thrive.
We're glad we had the time to talk about it at a little more length today, and we both thank you both, Becky Bollinger and Ben Libna, for joining us, sharing your expert perspectives on our climate situation. Thanks again.